Welcome back. So this practice is called Donglin, and that means sending and receiving. And we're going to take our natural human tendency, or habitual human tendency, I should say, to have inner conversations with people. And in most of the stages of this, we're going to imagine somebody in front of us, somebody who's suffering from something, and we want to take that suffering away. So we're going to breathe it in and visualize like dense, sticky, heavy clouds. That's sort of how we'll visualize the suffering. We're not going to take the story in. For example, if they broke their arm, we're not going to imagine that we're actually taking the broken arm, but rather the suffering from the broken arm. You see what I'm saying? So we'll breathe that in right into our heart, because that's where we feel the compassion and where we want to take the suffering in and then give out happiness, temporary happiness, relief from suffering, and permanent, ultimate happiness. Why not? And we're going to start with ourselves, and we're going to breathe for ourselves. And then we're going to think of people we can easily feel connection with, compassion for, and we'll step it out to one of them, then another one, and so on. Then we'll imagine people we normally are fairly indifferent about, frankly, or we don't know, or something like that. And we'll breathe for them, because we get this tide of compassion going. We want to step it out. We want to take all of their suffering away, and we want to bring happiness to all of them. And then we'll step it out further and further until it's really all and everyone. And so then we're expanding our hearts to include the whole ocean. Now, the source of the happiness doesn't have to be ourselves, because that sounds very depleting, doesn't it? But we're a pass-through. Our caring, compassionate heart is a pass-through. And so the suffering comes through this way, and then the happiness comes through that way. So that's how it works. And among all of the sentient beings in the whole ocean is this one, ourselves. And so we can imagine, if you want to just take a moment to decide on something that's up for you right now, that you're suffering from. Let's pick something real. But I suggest this first time out of the gate, don't pick the huge thing that you might be suffering from, but pick something that's just, not going so well for you. It can be a physical pain, maybe you're just getting over being sick with a cold. It seems like I've met a whole bunch of people with colds, passing them around. So it can be something as simple as that, or maybe you had a misunderstanding with somebody and it's just not feeling good. So something that's up for you, but again, not the big colossal thing. So decide on that. And now, sitting comfortably with your back straight. You don't have to be in full lotus or anything like that. Closing your eyes so that you can visualize well. Then imagine your small, suffering self inside your heart. We're going to spend some time with this stage of it because we're Westerners and we're more habituated to this even than Mingyur Rinpoche. And so we see that small suffering self inside our hearts. Now you want to take that suffering away from this one. And so your compassionate heart can absorb that. So visualize, especially the face of that small suffering part of yourself. and breathe in the suffering in the form of those dense, heavy clouds. Breathe in, taking it away. You naturally want to replace it with happiness. And so you exhale bright, light, lofty clouds, glowing clouds into that suffering one. See them soaking in. And breathe again. Breathing equally in and out. And as those glowing clouds soak into the suffering one, you see the clenched face begin to relax, begin to open, brighten. And again, breathe in the dense clouds. And breathing out the spacious glowing clouds. Letting yourself feel strongly this desire to take away that suffering and bring happiness. Immediate and permanent. Normally, that suffering self is kind of held at bay, but now you've brought it forward, and you're caring for this suffering self. And by now, this small self has become lighter, more open, smiling, joyful. And with one last breath, we then think of someone close to us. Someone who maybe is suffering something similar. And time, linear time being an illusion, maybe it was something they experienced in the past that was similar. We don't want them to suffer either. And so we breathe for them. Breathing in those dense, almost sticky clouds of suffering. Breathing them right into our hearts. And breathing out bright, spacious clouds. Glowing clouds. We see them soaking into this one who we love. And another breath. And and their face opens, brightens, relaxes, and becomes happy. Maybe you can think of someone else who you also feel close to. Maybe they've suffered something somehow similar. We don't want them to suffer either. We want to take that suffering away and replace it with happiness. And so we breathe for them. Now we open this up and we think of everyone in this room who has probably experienced something similar. And as this tide of compassion rolls out, we think we don't want even one person in this room to experience that kind of suffering. And so we breathe for all of the people in this room. Equal breaths in and out. Remembering that we're only breathing in the suffering, not the story, just the suffering. And now this tide of compassion rolls out much, much further. We imagine that there are whole classes of beings who have suffered something similar. For example, if it's a health problem, we think of all those who are quite sick in hospitals and so on. If it's about being misunderstood, there are whole classes of beings. Frankly, we've all been misunderstood in some way or another. So we breathe for everyone. So those dark clouds are coming in from all directions, and the bright clouds rolling out in all directions. And then one last breath for all beings. May all beings be happy. So I ask you to stop and reflect for a moment. How are you feeling right now? What are you feeling right now? You might jot it down, or at least note it in your mind.
So we're going to kind of get back, not that we have left, but more in the, what is the usual form of talking about forgiveness, because the compassion is all linked to forgiveness, right? It's all linked to forgiving oneself. It's all linked to having that muscle that allows us to forgive. And so I think that there's some misinformation about what forgiveness is. Because often we think, that it means something like that you're accepting something that you shouldn't be accepting. Like, you may have acted out in a certain way, and like what I did. It's not like I say, well, I forgive myself, so therefore I'll just keep doing it. So it's not that. It's not pardoning, not a pardon for accepting an act that is actually unforgivable, because some things, feel like they're unforgivable. And that's not what it is. Because often what actually happened is probably not, it really wasn't okay. And so, but it is accepting that, looking at that, okay? Looking at whatever that act was, or whatever that act wasn't, from the doing or the not doing. And it doesn't mean that you forget it either. Forgiveness doesn't mean, well, I'm gonna forgive myself, but now I don't, it's out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't mean that either, but how you remember it and what you do with that memory is different. You're not taking that memory in and slogging yourself and really looking at it in a way of beating yourself up. You're letting go of that. But knowing, again, because we all want to grow. And the only way we're going to grow is by remembering, knowing things that we did in the past that we're not going to do in the future, that we really don't want to create. We don't want to recreate this cause and condition in the future. And so the forgiveness is about how you passionately hold in your heart maybe a terrible wrong, while acting in the world to correct that wrong, all right? To correct it and to prevent it from ever happening again. So what forgiveness is, I looked up what Webster said, that was what forgiveness is, and what forgiveness is. Webster says it's stop feeling angry or resentment towards someone for an offense, flaw, or mistake. Martin Luther King says, first of all, it is a pardon. It is a fresh start, another chance, a new beginning for yourself. It's a fresh start, a new beginning for yourself. Forgiveness is actually a way to end suffering. That habitual habit, again, that we talked about, that Lama Tsomo so beautifully talked about, around that chasing things, pushing things away, or grasping. That mind that continues the story. Forgiveness is a way of stopping that suffering and bringing dignity back and harmony back into your life. It reclaims that energy and sense of balance for yourself. So forgiveness is fundamentally for you, right? It's not for anyone else but yourself, the self-forgiveness that we're talking about, the first direction of forgiveness. That self-forgiveness is for you. And it is actually the first step before also you can ask for forgiveness. Because if you haven't forgiven yourself on whatever it is, it's difficult to ask for forgiveness. So it brings about your own mental well-being. That well-being, you can let go of the story. You can let go of the story that continues to repeat itself in your mind. Because not to forgive just gives rise to more suffering. So what do you want to choose? You want to continue to suffer, or you want to let it go? Because you deserve to let it go. Remember, all of us, every single one of us makes mistakes and does things that we regret. It's part of being in this body. And so you can give yourself permission to let it go and to forgive yourself and to stop that repeated story, the violence that you're creating in your own heart. You can let it go. And that's what forgiveness actually is. It's for you to get out of your own prison that you've created. So, a little bit about where I am now with that situation that I told you about. It has taken me a while, and a lot of therapy and practice and living my life in a way that who is it that I want to be in the world? And what is it that I don't want to be in the world? And I feel like after, it's been many, many years now, I finally did forgive myself. And again, or I couldn't even talk about it here if I hadn't. And I have forgiven myself. And it was hard. It was a big one. It was the biggest one in these 60 plus years that I've been on the planet. It's the biggest one for me. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
And for myself, as a mother, letting down my child in this way that I considered so important, that was a hard one for me. And I think I would say that I still, of course, regret it. I still know that it wasn't okay. But I learned from it and have been able to move forward from it, and I don't find myself wallowing in guilt and self-flagellation, as you were talking about. And I've talked with her about it. She's now a grown-up. She's 36 years old and a regular meditator, actually. And so I've offloaded the resenting myself. I think of it as sort of offloading it. It doesn't do any good. And so the only productive aspect of that is the being clear, this wasn't okay, doing my best to make reparations, as you talked about, and finding ways to even do a sort of a different version of pay it forward in helping others, like tonight. And as I said, talking with my daughter about it. And so that feels productive. And the just going on resenting myself and feeling guilty wasn't productive. So that brings me to a sense of resolution. and allows me to do this practice that we Westerners so often have to do for ourselves, which is to like myself, to love myself just as much as any other creature, and to have compassion for myself too. So that's where I am at this point.
So we're exposing ourselves up here, and I don't know if things are coming up for you all about something in your life, something that that maybe that you may have regrets. And so we want you to just, right. So we really would love you to take some time, some personal time right now, and to think about the thing that has gripped your heart, that you may regret. And we want you to see if that how might you relate to yourself differently now around that? How might you relate to yourself differently now, given whatever? Do you have something that you can do differently? Can you feel into it differently now? Just take about, I don't know, about 5 minutes to do that. So I think we're going to go into meditation. Yeah.
So bringing your mind to that spacious ocean state. That ocean of awareness, full potentiality that gives rise to all form. Then once again, we bring our small suffering self either in front of us or inside our hearts. Picking a specific suffering. And perhaps now it's the suffering of regret. And we hold ourselves tenderly. We want to give this suffering self compassion. We want to take away this suffering. So we breathe in the dense, heavy clouds of the suffering itself, just the suffering itself. And our hearts are this window to the vast ocean. And from the vast ocean through our hearts, we breathe the glowing clouds of happiness and see them soaking into the suffering one. And breathing again. Our compassionate heart does this alchemy, does this amazing process of taking the suffering and drawing through and into the suffering one vast joy, lightness, spaciousness. See that face opening up, brightening, softening. Smiling, breathing again and again. Then imagining someone you care about, imagining them suffering. Perhaps you know of something they regret. You don't want them to suffer. You want to take that away and replace it with happiness. So again, you breathe in the suffering itself and breathe joy, happiness, the glowing clouds into them. And you see their face change. And now you imagine everyone in this room, everyone on this block, and they have some suffering of regret. You don't want them to suffer. You want them to feel joy. And so you breathe for all of them. Again, the heavy, dense clouds come in, and the glowing, spacious clouds go through and out to them, soaking in. And then you think of all beings who at one time or another, and time is actually not linear. So in the eternal now, all beings have regret. We want to take away the suffering, simply the suffering. And so we breathe that in from all beings. And our compassionate heart draws great joy from the vast ocean. And we breathe out the glowing, spacious clouds of happiness to all beings.
And if you're so inclined, you might want to bring your hand to your heart, if that feels appropriate. And there's some phrases of forgiveness that I'll read and say, and just take them in, soak them in, repeating quietly to yourself. for any way that I have caused harm to myself through judgment, action, self-blame, indifference, knowingly or unknowingly, in thought, word, or deed. May I forgive myself. May I allow myself to be a student of life and make mistakes. May I forgive myself. And if I cannot do it in this moment, may I be able to forgive myself in the future. For any way that I have caused harm to myself through judgment, action, self-blame, indifference, knowingly or unknowingly, in thought, word, or deed. May I forgive myself. May I allow myself to be a student of life and make mistakes. May I forgive myself. And if I cannot do it in this moment, may I be able to forgive myself in the future. May I forgive myself. Thank you all so much for your kind attention.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Be well, be well. Take good care of your hearts. Yeah.